Good evening. Welcome to Facebook Live. Jana is doing the videography right now. She's not in front of the camera, she's behind holding it. Tonight I'm going to be talking about something that President Trump raised an issue last week about what should immigration look like in the United States. And he made some arguments that we should have less family reunification visas in the United States. He said that it's almost 60% of the visas that are granted to immigrants coming in are reuniting families, and made the argument that we should have merit-based immigration visas. And my mind real quickly said, hey, as a missionary, as a guy who's planted churches my whole life and has invested in immigrant communities in the United States, that one causes me to pause. And I want to think not only about what does that do as a missionary, but how do we approach citizenship in the United States. And I really feel like I need to speak on this one as a missionary. Now, before I get into that, kind of give you a couple quick updates of some things that are going on in our family. First, my daughter Sophia and my granddaughter, Jana and I's granddaughter Penny, are with us for a whole week. They came from Philadelphia. And you may have seen a post we did a couple of days ago. You've probably figured out that we're living really hand to mouth. This has been economically the most humble season we've ever had, and we've generally had humble seasons throughout our life. And somehow we survived, but it's been a very humble season. And 2 days ago, as we were in our vehicle going to pick up Penny and Sophia, when I went to start it, it didn't start. I called my son Caleb. In fact, he lives right across the street, saw me try to start it. Caleb came over, jumped it. We hopped in, we drove 3 blocks, and the whole thing completely shut down. And I spent the morning trying to get the car into the shop. Sophia got an Uber. And when we got the car into the shop, our power steering had a major leak. And with the leak, the fluid had gotten into the alternator and destroyed the alternator, and we needed a new power steering pump and a new alternator. We've got a good mechanic. He's a Korean immigrant, a real honest guy named Ty. Really like him. But it cost about $1,000. We simply didn't have it. We had saved a little money for some transitions we were going to make, and we put up, hey, we could use some help. And I'm going to say this, Jana and I have generally, if you are watching our Facebook, you'll notice who is affirming what we're doing, and it's generally people who have done mission work outside the United States or African diaspora. They're our biggest fans. Both of those type of people economically are humble people. And basically, in the last 24 hours, we've received more donations than we needed to pay for the vehicle being repaired, but frankly, we're barely making it. In fact, most months we're not, but we've just been amazed at the generosity, and it's coming from humble people whose lives have been impacted by church planting and missions and have strong connections in Africa. Thank you. Second thing, just kind of family update. I also put this up, and maybe it's too long, but we're going into Memorial Day weekend. And 101 years ago today, my great-uncle, Uncle Sanford Cornelius Eichhorn, died on the battlefields in France. And I just knew that my grandmother's brother had died. For some reason, I remembered the date. I remember my grandma Jenkins, her and I, on Memorial Days going together to Sanford's grave. And a year ago, when I went to his grave, I noticed there was some military information about it, and it always, as a kid, just went right through my mind. I never thought much about it, but I saw 1st Division on the grave, and I thought, oh, the 1st Division museum is in Wheaton, Illinois, which is the suburb just south of where I live. I went down there, and we've gotten some information about Sanford and starting to kind of flesh out who was this young man? What did he go through? And he died 5 days before the battle actually started, so he would have been on the front lines doing something in the probes, and hitting me pretty profoundly because my grandma deeply grieved. We're going into Memorial Day, and I hope for all of you that are listening, You may go to a ball game, you may watch one, you may have a cookout, you may have your neighbors over, you may travel to the lake. Pause for a moment and think about the sacrifices that so many young men and young women made, the freedom we've given. And like my great uncle Sanford, I've never met him, but I remember my grandma's grief. And I feel like I've got to carry that grief for the rest of my life. Now let me shift back to the issue of family immigration visas. President Trump raised the issue, and if you listen to it purely from an individualistic standpoint, if you take Bible presuppositions out of the conversation, if you think what is the most advantageous way to grow an economy of a nation, say you believe America first, my nation first, his reasoning made a lot of sense. It's just saying, okay, let's get the most talented people, let's get the most hardworking people, let's bring in people that have financial resources to invest, and they get our visas first. But I'm going to take a pause. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but there's other guys, I think Matthew Soren's at World Relief, and some others are making some arguments based on compassion. Some are making arguments based upon the implications of law. But over 60% of immigrants who enter the United States come on family reunification visas. It's been part of our national fabric to build family. And if we stop that immediately, one thing that's happening is all the people who are in the line, who have waited their turn, get pushed to the bottom. That doesn't seem just to me. Others have made the argument, and these are family members. We're taking family and we're keeping them ripped apart. Let me push into another issue that I'm not seeing discussed as much as I think it should be. One of the images, one of the metaphors, one of the illustrations in the Bible about what our relationship with God is like and what our relationship with other believers is like is family. God's described as our Father. Jesus refers to how he wanted to gather Jerusalem like a mother hen. We are referred to as God's children. We're referred to as adopted children. Our inheritance is described, or our blessings in Christ are described as our inheritance. The church is described as the family of God. The words brother and sister is used so often to describe who we are to one another. And when Paul commands us how we're to behave, describes us to care for one another the way you would care for one another in a family. And people of God, I want you to seriously think about, if we are in God's Word frequently, it should be so much a part of us, so much a part of our reasoning and our language and our thought and our action. And when we hear someone speak where they're kind of casting aside family and saying, here's an economic model we want, that should kind of push inside, go, something's not right about that. Because it's so enmeshed in the Bible that God's people are family. Pause on that one. I want to make sure I've got all my notes. First cause, it's family. Second, I know that there is some discussion, well, what should immigration look like? And I'm going to say, I think when immigration goes well, it goes well when it looks like family. Now, one of the words that I hear thrown around as people are discussing what should immigration look like when people from another nation come to the United States is a phrase they'll use is, we want people to assimilate. And again, I want people to pause, particularly if you go to church frequently and you read your Bible. Take down some Old Testament history, pull it off your shelf, and start to dig around and look for who has used the word assimilate to describe how they want immigrants to relate to their nation. And if you do that, you will find that empires use the word assimilate to describe how they want conquered people to relate to their nation. And if you go back through Old Testament, maybe one of the clearest examples is Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And basically, after they were conquered, Babylon says, we want the most talented Jewish men, the ones we haven't slaughtered. We're going to bring them, and basically we're going to try to wipe out their language and their culture, and we're going to use the most skilled people for our economic gain. That's assimilation and how empires do it. Now, I don't remember in my American history, my American government classes, when we talked about what were the ideals that founded the American experience. That wasn't how we approach things. If we're asking for assimilation, we're not talking about the ideals of this nation. We're talking about the ideals of an empire, and the United States is not an empire. That's not how we've wanted to relate to the world. A word that I'm going to argue we should be using is adaptation. And missionaries do this all the time. They go from one nation to another, and when you do that, you have to think real hard, what's the Bible say? And you have to understand history, and you have to understand theology, and then you have to go to this new nation, and you have to learn their languages and their cultures, and you have to wrestle with what portions of my home nation, my home culture do I bring? What do I discard? What do I take from the home nation, the new nation? What do I discard? And how do I take the gospel and make it fit here? And I would like for those of you who read the Bible and want to see God move in the United States to use the word adaptation to say this is what we want our immigrant communities to do. We want them to come and adapt and bring the best of their cultures, the most godly, light-bearing portions of their culture, because we need that to become part of our American melting pot, and to confront the portions of our society in America that are full of darkness. We want them to adapt and bring the best and make us the best. Now let me clarify a little bit too. What is immigration like? I know that if you see immigrants coming here in their first arrival, it's full of optimism. And if you spend some time with them and go through a couple of years and see them adapt and thrive and stand and take the Pledge of Allegiance and become American citizens, you see these bright moments of hope. But in reality, when you go from one culture to another, it's disorientating, it's baffling, it's exhausting, it's confusing. You've got new languages, new cultures, the nuances of a culture, the humor, the rhythms, the mannerisms, the unwritten rules and the written rules. You've got new bureaucracy to get through. You've got new relationships. And when you're going through that, you dare not go through that alone. It's part of the reason that mission organizations rarely send one missionary to a new nation or a new city. They tend to send them in teams going, they're going to need one another. They're going to need somebody to help them register their kids for school and register their kids for sports. They're going to need people who will help them learn how to buy groceries. They're going to need them to help open bank accounts, find jobs, get health insurance, buy cars. And when you get a better job, it's a relationship. Or get a job, it's a relationship that helps you get a better job. But when you realize you're never going to get the job you want, you need some friends who will form businesses and start new things. It's somebody who, when life is tough, and you're sick, and you're tired, and you're broken, or somebody dies, it's somebody you can cry on their shoulder. And when you have scads of success, when your kids are thriving in high school or college, and you want to throw a party, you need people you know to come to you. We want immigrants to come as communities. Frankly, every now and then I get a phone call that are some really sad stories that happen to immigrants in this country. People who struggle with depression, who become addicts, some who commit suicide. And every time where I find a tragic situation, it's an individual who was isolated. If they were able to live in community, the odds of isolation go down, and they do much better. Now, as I'm talking about what ideal immigration looks like, it's done by a community. It's extended family-like relationships who take care of one another and nurture one another, and by doing that they actually adapt better and they have more success and they become more part of the experience. I bet you those who are thinking churchy are going, well, actually, Dave, what you're talking about is the formation of churches. And if you've been around church starts most of your life, you realize that most of the time when a church starts and it goes well, you've got a couple of families that probably are related to one another and a couple more who are friends, and they've got 5 to 10 family units that have all showed up in some place and going, you know what, we should start a church. And one of the things that happens when people come with some amount of social glue is the odds are they're going to start new churches. And if they're coming from places like Latin America or Korea or the Philippines or sub-Saharan Africa, they're coming into the United States looking around going, I'm a believer, I'm trying to figure this whole thing out, I need other believers near me, I need some people who understand me. And if there's enough of them in a single location or a nearby location of a similar cultural or linguistic background, they're going to start churches. Not only will they start churches, they'll start community organizations, they'll have their local kids in sport teams that may be ethnically based. But if they come from a nation with a Christian heritage, it's going to feel a lot like how things were 30, 40, 50 years ago in the United States, where their secular organizations start with a prayer. When they face a difficulty, they'll freely open a Bible and say, well, God said this, what do we do? We're going to build more churches and have a more godly influence in this nation if we allow families to come together, and their extended families are here because there's social glue. Last point I want to make, and I'm going to sound like I'm a visionary, but I'm going to go back to what the American experience is like. If you hang around certain denominations in the United States and you start digging through their history, you're going to find, I'll give you a few examples. There's a Baptist denomination called the North American Baptists. If you dig around in their history, a few generations ago, they called themselves German Baptist. There's a denomination called Converge. A few years ago, they were called General Baptists. A couple generations ago, they were the Swedish Baptists. There's a denomination called the Evangelical Free Church, and if you dig around their history, they were once called the Swedish Free Church. There's a denomination called the Evangelical Church, and if you dig around, they're the Evangelical Covenant Church. They were once the Swedish Covenant Church. Historically, this has happened many, many times. Immigrants come as an extended family. They land in the United States. They cluster together. They help one another adapt. They start to thrive. They start new churches. And then something starts to happen where the kids come home and the kids don't feel comfortable speaking German anymore or Swedish anymore. And the kids are more comfortable in English. And the kids are going to school with other kids that speak English. And they're on the sports teams and band teams. And the kids get married and they marry someone who's a little bit different ethnicity, and they start to incorporate into the church. And about a generation into it, what had once been a group of ethnic immigrants has become the point where the gospel really thrives, where the kids have picked up their parents' deep values. Parents' deep values, but they've adapted to the American experience. And these old ethnic churches go boom because they can go multicultural. I think we're already starting to see this in some churches, some Latino churches, some Korean churches, some Filipino churches, and if you look to Europe, you can find African-based churches that have hit their second generation, and they are the most capable people in a society to build other church planting movements because they can go multicultural and they can understand a lot of complex things, and their leaders are exceptional. They look like Paul, they look like Daniel. Closing. Part of what I'm talking about, some will say, oh, Dave, you should talk about this. Pastors shouldn't talk about politics. I understand that perspective. I don't think the Bible teaches that. Intuitively, I have been a church planting missionary my whole life. I'm still a missionary, and there are certain dynamics that make the gospel go boom. One is, how does a nation deal with immigration? The United States historically has been a nation that has prioritized the well-being of families, and that historic ideal is one of the reasons this country has thrived. It's one of the reasons that people historically have gone to churches, and our faith has influenced this nation. I want to encourage you, if you're somebody like me who votes most elections and probably about every 3 months is on a phone with a government official or sending off a letter, today's one of these days where you need to sit down and say, I'm going to write my senator, my representative, I'm going to make a phone call and say, hey, we need to make some changes in immigration, but let's make sure we prioritize extended families. Families are the building block for churches, and churches are the building blocks for a strong nation. Thank you for watching me. God's blessings on your evening.